All right, so today we're talking cultural diffusion, and this is a term that means essentially the spread of culture from one place to another. So today we're going to talk about one of the two main types of cultural diffusion, and sort of the subtypes that fall into what we would call expansion diffusion. Okay, so the term expansion diffusion refers to when elements of culture spread to new places while staying strong in their original locations. So essentially, what I would think of this as is the spread of culture within a geographic area. So it doesn't become dislocated from the original hearth. So there's three types of expansion diffusion we'll get to today: contagious, hierarchical, and stimulus diffusion. All right. So, and here we see kind of the idea of expansion diffusion. Essentially, the expansion from a hearth, and kind of still being confined to a geographic area. So you can see a little bit of that with the spread of Islam, which spread many different ways, but really kind of all of the different types of expansion diffusion we see. A lot of hierarchical and stimulus and contagious diffusion there. And in the other map, we see the spread of language. So you can see, with some notable exceptions, specifically the brown arrows that you see, that would be an example of relocation diffusion. But most of these seem like they are relatively staying within a specific geographic area. So I would consider those to be examples of expansion diffusion. So talking about how culture spreads within a geographic area. So the first type is called contagious diffusion. Okay. And it is a lot of what it sounds like. So contagious diffusion refers to when we see rapid, widespread diffusion kind of outward from a hearth. So it spreads kind of similarly the way that a disease would spread. So you can see that in the diagram we see the hearth in the middle, and then the diffusion kind of outward in most every direction equally. So in recent years, contagious diffusion has gotten the sort of reputation of being less about person-to-person contact, kind of rapid person-to-person contact, and more through internet and social media. So while you still can have rapid person-to-person contact, if you think of the game Telephone, that's kind of an example of contagious diffusion. Nowadays, we see this happening through the internet and through social media and through memes. So I've tried to pick some nice geography related memes for you. But memes would be an example of contagious diffusion, where someone, sits in their office or I don't know, whatever, and comes up with a meme and then shoots it out there, and it goes viral and goes everywhere. And that would be contagious diffusion. So the next type of cultural diffusion is called hierarchical diffusion. So it has a lot to do with the word hierarchy, which means like an established chain that has kind of a element of positions of authority or power. So hierarchical diffusion is the spread of culture from positions of authority or power to other people. So I would say some sort of emulation of political leaders or celebrities. Advertising itself is hierarchical diffusion, right? Companies and celebrities have social and economic power, and they use that to diffuse downward to the rest of us, right? To diffuse into populations what they want us to do. I guess, I don't know, maybe not. And then social elites like JTT, which is a joke that you probably don't get, so that's okay. So oftentimes hierarchical diffusion, we would say, originates in large urban areas and then spreads to smaller markets or more isolated kind of rural areas. So the way that I think of it is the example I always use is fashion, right? Where do most of the fashion trends in the world start? Probably places like LA and New York City and Paris and Milan and some of the big kind of fashion centers. And then those might kind of diffuse downward to other major cities. And then they end up in like Milwaukee or something later, a few years later. I don't know. So that would be kind of a general hierarchical spread. And the last one's the most confusing. But I like it. I think it is a really interesting way to think about cultural diffusion, and that's called stimulus diffusion. So it is when essentially the underlying idea of an element of culture spreads, but specific characteristics are changed to fit more local preferences. I got a phone call there. So we see kind of the basic idea of something spreading, but it's altered to fit local needs. So I like food as an example for this one, because food is oftentimes very much example of stimulus diffusion. We see certain types of food spreading to new places, but then it gets altered to kind of meet local food preferences. So I have good old Panda Express here. We see some not authentic Chinese food, right? But you have sort of the underlying idea of, a lot of these staple dishes that people eat within China being altered, and then we come up with, fried chicken chunks that are covered in some sort of sauce. Because that is more what Americans like to eat, right? So you have sort of the underlying idea of certain types of dishes spreading, but it being changed to fit local needs. And I always think of like nice Chinese restaurants that you would go to in like the international district. Oftentimes they'll have a menu for people that are ethnically Chinese, or accustomed to more kind of local cuisine within China, and then they'll have a menu that is appealing more to Americans. And then another sort of China-related example is social media. So one thing that's interesting, or maybe not interesting as much as, I don't know, probably troubling in many ways, is that China has a lot of social media, and their social media looks a lot like American social media. You see a lot of these kind of examples of things. The only one you probably recognize is TikTok, because that's a Chinese company that operates in the US. But they essentially have Chinese versions of most big kind of social media that you use. And the reason is because they probably couldn't get American tech companies to fit in with what the Chinese government, specifically kind of the level of censorship the Chinese government wants them to do within the app. So essentially they just make kind of new versions of them. To fit, I don't want to say the local needs, because it's more of a government mandate. But I would consider that to be stimulus diffusion, where you have the underlying idea of something spreading, but you have specific changes that are made to fit within the boundaries of what is either wanted, or in this case, what is mandated. So I would call that stimulus diffusion. All right. So tomorrow we will talk about relocation diffusion.